The resting membrane potential is the net electrical potential difference that exists across the cell membrane, and this is created by the movement of charged molecules across that membrane. For neurons, this potential is about negative 70 millivolts, with the inside of the neuron being negative relative to the outside. And the most important ions involved in generating and maintaining the resting potential are potassium and sodium. And so I'm going to recap what I just said. Inside of the cell, negative 70 millivolts. And we have potassium as well as sodium that are defining this membrane potential. So membrane potential is just, it simply means that there is some number of millivolts. Alright, so I'm going to talk about the potassium concentration inside and outside of the cell. So I'm going to draw here the cell membrane. The cell membrane divides the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And so if I were to draw the potassium concentration, I would have to show you that inside of the cell there are a lot more of potassium ions. And that number is actually 140 millivolts compared to the outside, where there is only about 4 millimolar. This concentration difference makes it very favorable for the potassium ions to move outside of the cell. So this is the movement that is actually going to happen due to this concentration gradient that is generated. Now these are moved, this movement, this outward movement is facilitated by potassium leak channels that are found in the cell membrane. So it allows the leakage of these potassiums. And as this happens, you can imagine the potassium ion being positive, since it has a positive sign. And as it leaves, it will leave the cell behind more negative. And outside of the cell will be becoming more and more positive. However, as negative charge builds up inside the cells, the potassium will be drawn back into the cell due to that attraction between the potassium ions that have just left and the negative potassium building inside of the cell. So I'm going to repeat again. As the potassium channels are leaving, it will become more and more negative inside the cell. This will create an attraction that will cause this potassium ions to come back into the cell. At a certain potential, each potassium cation that is pushed outside due to that concentration gradient will be matching by that another potassium cation outside of the cell be pulled back in due to the electrical potential. At this point, there's not going to be any net movement of the ion, and the cell is set to be in equilibrium with respect to potassium. The potential difference that represents this potassium equilibrium, it's called the equilibrium potential of potassium. And its potential, it's about negative 90 millivolts. The negative sign due to convention, but it is also because the positive potassium ion, it's leaving the cell. So because it's leaving, they made it negative, leaving the cell. So the next thing that needs to be considered is the sodium ion. So right away we see a major difference between sodium and potassium, because in sodium there's actually a lot less. Let's draw this little so we see it's a lot less sodium inside of the cell. So there's actually around 12 millimolar compared to the outside, which is 145 millimolar. Okay, so first thing you gotta ask yourself is, what is going to be the concentration gradient? Well, the concentration gradient that it's showing us is sodium's outside of the cell will be moving into the cell. So these sodium ions are going to want to move in. And what happens when they move in? They're going to become more and more positive inside the cell. So this movement is facilitated, like I explained before, by the sodium leak channels. And it will cause the buildup of an electric potential. And this clearing potential of sodium, it's around positive 60 millivolts. So the equilibrium potential of sodium is around 60 millivolts. What does that mean? Well, that just means that just like we talked about the potassium, there will be an electrical potential. Once this is going to become very positive compared to the outside, it will start to move the ions back towards the outside of the cell. And when there's a net movement of sodium ions moving into the cell and moving out of the cell, is what is called the equilibrium potential of sodium, which is at positive 60 millivolts. So at positive 60 millivolts, you will see this no net movement. Okay? And it's positive, sorry, because it's moving into the cell. In a living system, sodium and potassium are flowing across the cell membrane at the same time. So this is actually happening both at the same time. So let's draw. So this is a sodium leak channel. They only allow sodium ions to move across these leaky channels, and these are potassium leak channels that only allow potassium to move across. Potassium inside, very big, inside, outside not so much. And same thing for sodium. Sodium very big outside, very small inside. Will cause the movement of sodium into the cell, will cause the movement of potassium outside of the cell. Alright? So the potassium concentration gradient causes the potassium to leak out of the cell through these potassium leak channels. At the same time, sodium is moving in the opposite direction with the opposite effect, as I just explained. In a certain sense, sodium undoes the effect of potassium's movement. The resting potential is therefore a tug of war. Potassium's movement pulls the cell potential toward negative 90 millivolts, while sodium's movement pulls the cell potential the opposite way, towards positive 60 millivolts. But neither ion wins. Instead, there's a balance of these two effects, and that effect is that negative 70 millivolts that we talked about. And that accounts for the resting membrane potential. This is the resting membrane potential. The resting membrane potential is closer. Why is it closer to the potassium rather than the sodium? That's very simple, because the answer for that is that the cell is slightly more permeable to potassium. So both ions continue to leak across the cell. After this, there's going to be something that brings the ions back to their gradients if this resting potential wants to be maintained. And the cell utilizes the sodium potassium ATPase, which what it does is it continually pumps the sodium that was building up inside the cell to be thrown outside of the cell.